Outside of public school, people get their history from all kinds of places. Sometimes it's movies, YouTube videos. Sometimes people get it by microdosing through TikTok. And the better of these range from being serviceable to pretty good in terms of historical accuracy. As far as movies go, they're never really trying that hard to be accurate, just enough to not be disrespectful to the setting while also effectively creating the illusion it's really the era it's supposed to be, assuming they even want to be accurate. While YouTube videos can vary wildly from excellent to blurring the line between slop history and pop history. Video games also generally follow the trend that movies do, with some exceptions that aim to scratch that niche itch, which brings us to the topic of today's video. So War Thunder has the largest catalog of real military vehicles in any video game, albeit with some cheating, but because of this, the tank and plane nerds flock to it like a flytrap. So what's the problem with War Thunder? What's the crux of the issue? I'm not going to be nitpicking at the hyper-specifics of vehicles, rather I just want to talk about how War Thunder effectively alters people's perception of how these vehicles are used and interact. The average War Thunder player should understand these vehicles better than the average person and know that tanks don't just sit in fields and shoot at each other, but the way these vehicles interact in-game reinforces some common misconceptions. To put it even more clearly, War Thunder is able to reinforce a misunderstanding of a very specific aspect of history to not the average person, but military history enthusiasts. A demographic that should be better at understanding these things, but content like War Thunder combats that in an interesting way. It's not that it distorts history, but just changes the way we think about history. You might understand that these vehicles existed within a greater, more complicated context, but when the game you're playing every other day is just mashing tanks into each other, it could help you forget that. Whenever you see a vehicle in a documentary, your experience with it in War Thunder will be sitting in the back of your head and might cause you to challenge what you hear, even subtly. In my rat tank problem video, I discussed the lack of balance between lighter and heavier vehicles and mostly how rats outperform heavy tanks where it matters, especially if the lighter tank happened to have a powerful gun. But what I don't highlight is that to some extent this is just the nature of a game like War Thunder. No matter how many people are actually in a plane, tank, or ship, there is always only one person controlling it, which means it is much easier to pull off crazy maneuvers when you don't need to communicate between driver and gunner. Drifting and broadsiding heavy tanks is just a matter of knowing where they are and building up enough speed. Obviously, War Thunder is still a video game, and these things are fun and cool, but unlike most other games, War Thunder markets itself as being realistic. But what aspect of War Thunder is actually realistic beyond the damage model? Its only actual advantage it has over something like World of Tanks. It does this thing where it's realistic enough to grant itself this air of realism where people might forget how arcadey, realistic, and even the sim mode is. Provided War Thunder isn't all bad, that huge roster of tanks does introduce people to vehicles they may not have had any real way of knowing about. When I first made this channel, I did it with the intention of making the occasional short about an old obscure plane using War Thunder, because more often than not, War Thunder is still the only game where you can actually play one of those planes. But this also reinforces the previous problem. Instead of players having knowledge about this piece of equipment going in, if it's not something that was mass-produced and commonly known, they might not know anything about it at all, and their one and only exposure to it is War Thunder. Ultimately, it's just something else that reinforces very dull stat comparisons that ignore literally everything else about tanks besides the big three: armor, gun, and mobility. The BR system also emphasizes this idea that there really is such thing as a better tank, and not just vehicles being scaled against each other in the microcosm of Eastern Europe. For example, the Sherman, despite being an adversary to the Tiger, is placed at a lower BR. It's not actually inferior, it's just not as good in the very specific field of two tanks shooting at each other in an open field. Which also reinforces the existing myth of the Sherman being a death trap. War Thunder has a lot of issues in terms of actual realism. Basically every vehicle is a victim of one issue or another, whether it be the lack of traction that every tank has or the insane amount of Gs you're allowed to pull in airplanes. With some more specific examples of reload times being deliberately but explicitly incorrect. But this is oftenly just for gameplay reasons. War Thunder is very good at cutting out the boring bits of realism and just keeping the fun ones. Something that it doesn't receive enough praise for in my opinion. A lot like my AI video, I just kind of want people to be a bit more mindful and self-aware about why they think about the things the way they do. Maybe then we'd have less wereaboos just saying shit. And commie boos. Especially commie boos actually. I'm sure most people are better than using War Thunder as a basis for how these vehicles are, but at the end of the day, no one is immune to propaganda regardless of how intentional or unintentional it might be. Ultimately, War Thunder offers an interesting dichotomy for military vehicle hobbyists, where on one hand it introduces a great deal of people to less common vehicles while also mildly poisoning them and their perception of these vehicles. Alright, that's it for today's vehicle. See y'all later. Fuck.